I said at the very beginning there were three foci for today's lecture. We covered what a polis was, and we looked at Sparta and Athens. We very briefly covered the importance of the Persian and the Peloponnesian Wars. Now I want to dig into two folks who covered those wars respectively. Herodotus, whose histories really go way back and start with the Persian Wars, start with the Trojan Wars and go all the way through the Persian Wars, which had happened not during his lifetime, but during the lifetime of people he knew. And then secondly, Thucydides, who very similarly grows up throughout the age of the Peloponnesian Wars and would probably have been a little kid at the time that Thucydides gave his funeral oration, which apparently 30 years later, when Pericles gave his funeral oration, which apparently 30 years later Thucydides wrote down. Up until this point, we don't have anybody who really is a historian. None of the sources we've read in this class we can consider history sources, right? They all involve gods coming in and interfering with people's lives. And they are all epics, or they're all religious in their context. But there's nothing that is based, as far as we know, on facts and interpretation of those facts. And so Herodotus writes this book, and I have here his opening page. He tells you right off the bat why he is writing. He says, these are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. He tells you where he's from. And by the way, where he's from is a ethnically Greek polis that is right on the coast of Asia Minor, which had been part of the Persian Empire. So Herodotus grows up as a Greek in the Persian Empire, knows both of them well. He researches this stuff. He talks to people who have been involved in the wars. He gets firsthand accounts, and he publishes them with the hope of preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and preventing the great and wonderful actions of Greeks and barbarians from losing their due needs of glory, and to explain why they fought. He basically says the most important thing that's ever happened to anyone ever was the Greek defeat of the Persians. So we need to put it down so that people don't forget about it. They don't forget what it was that let the Greeks be superior. And we're going to go all the way back to the Trojan War to show why there's been conflict between the two. The thing about this work, and you'll probably notice it in some of the excerpts you look at, and if you go way back, you would definitely notice it, is that Herodotus in many ways isn't that good of a historian. He does bring gods into the stories if somebody he interviewed brought them up. He repeats things that we know can't happen. He talks about insects that are as huge as humans. He talks about people surfing on dolphins' tails, is one of my favorite bits. But from his perspective, it doesn't matter if the facts are right. He builds very much off of Homer's tradition of an epic. And if you don't have a history before you, working off Homer's epic to teach lessons through the past is a pretty good approach. And so while Herodotus is not necessarily factual, he bases what he writes on fact. He has lessons in it, and he tries to explain something in the context of this conflict between Greeks and Persians. What I'm going to do on the next slide is kind of compare Thucydides, who comes a generation later. Think about why he says he writes, and then that will set you up to be in a good place to analyze those texts when you read them.